All right, good morning. We're ultimately going to be in Daniel chapter 9, looking at the 70 weeks prophecy, which is a challenging prophecy. But I don't think I've ever heard a Bible class on this 70 weeks prophecy. I've never, and all growing up, never. I've discussed it since, as a preacher, I've discussed it. Never had a class on it. So I kind of heard some things in passing here and there. I thought, well, if I've never heard it, chances are most people haven't actually had a Bible study on it. So we're going to look through it today. It's a really very important passage, prophecy. And it's one of the reasons the last half of Daniel is said to be written by a second author. And liberal scholars call it a second Daniel. A second author. And the reason for that is because they say it had to have been written much later. And the reason they say that is because it's so accurate in its details and the things that it's predicting. They said there's no way that Daniel could have seen what was going to happen so well. And so there has to be a second Daniel. That's the conclusion they came up to. And they fabricated some evidence. If you want to prove an idea, you can find some way to provide some kind of quote-unquote evidence to do it, especially with ancient documents. But I have not read all of their argumentation. I have no reason to think that there's two, but this definitely is a section of Scripture that is extremely powerful when we're talking about the preservation of the Bible and the evidence that the Bible is real. So we'll look at that a little bit, but in our reading, we looked at Psalm 137, which is a lament of the Israelites during captivity of Babylon, and longing to be able to go back to Jerusalem. We have Daniel chapters 9 through 12, which includes the 70-week prophecy, Daniel's prayer for his people, and visions of future kingdoms and conflicts that are coming up, and prophecies about the last days, the latter times, which we've discussed quite a bit already. And we have the book of Ezra, which covers the decree of Cyrus and the Jews returning to build the temple under Zerubbabel. And this was after the 70 years of captivity. And then Ezra, about halfway through, Ezra goes to Jerusalem and implements reforms in the worship, sets up the worship properly again. Then we have the book of Haggai, which is about building the temple and how they had started to build the temple, but under Zerubbabel, but stopped, and now he's trying to coax them and threaten them into getting back to work. The same thing with Zechariah and visions. There's quite a few visions and prophecies about the Messiah in the book of Zechariah. So that's a very general overview of what we were looking at. Let's go ahead and have a prayer so we can get going. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful that you have revealed yourself to us through your creation, through the things that you've done. We thank you that you've revealed yourself to us through your word that you've given to us. Help us, Lord, to understand you by seeking out the wisdom that is here. Help us to understand ourselves, that we can make application. We can be encouraged to be the people that you want us to become. Thank you, Father, for the opportunity to gather together today and the ability to do that. We can do this in comfort, and we can do this with full confidence that we will not be harassed inside here. We thank you, Lord, for that good protection and help. We pray, Lord, that whether we face this in the future or things change, our faith will continue to be strong and placed upon you and trusting in your providence and your help throughout life. Please be with our sick who are hurting. Please help them to overcome, to be able to be back to a full measure of health if it's your will. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Okay, so let's talk about Daniel chapter 9. We have the first 19 verses here talking about his prayer, which is a very good read in and of itself. And the humility that's there, his willingness to recognize sin, And it's related to the fact that if you look in verse 2, it says, "In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years specified by the word of the Lord through Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in desolations of Jerusalem. Then I set my face toward the Lord God to make requests by prayer and supplication with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes." So this tells us that he understood, he knew Jeremiah, he knew of his readings, and he said, Jeremiah said it was 70 years, and we're approaching 70 years here, so he begins praying and fasting that God would keep his promises and that he would remember his covenant with Israel. And in order to do this, though, he recognizes that there has to be some reconciliation of the people coming back to God. And this is what's going on here in the first 19 verses of this. And during this prayer, it says in verse 20, "While I was speaking, praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplications before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening offering. And he informed me and talked with me and said, 'O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand. At the beginning of your supplication, the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved. Therefore, consider the matter and understand the vision.'" All right. Now, this vision is related to what he's going to explain. The vision he's going to explain is going to relate to chapter 8. And this is related especially with, from verse 15 on, Gabriel interprets a vision, but this is still, there's things in the interpretation, things in the vision that bothered Daniel tremendously. It says in verse 27, "I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterward I rose and went to the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it." So it's just bothering him tremendously. He wants to get to the bottom of it and understand it because he knew it had to do with his people. And incidentally, this is when he starts praying. I don't know if this vision or is just the timing of it, but or if this perhaps prompted him to realize I need to start praying about this. But it is interesting how this works. Now in chapter 8, if you look at the heading, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Chapter 7, backing up even more, we have the visions of the four beasts, and these are the four beasts that represent four kingdoms that would rise. This is exactly the same as the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had with the statue with the four layers. These are four different kingdoms, and we know from chapter 7 and from chapter 2 with the vision, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, that these four nations were the same. That we have Babylon. What comes after Babylon? The Persians, and then after the Persians came the Greeks. And after the Greeks came the Romans. And according to Daniel chapter 2, in the days of the Roman kings, God would set up his kingdom that would never be destroyed. And that's the message of chapter 2, or that's much of the message in chapter 2. And in chapter 7, we have these they're not the same, these four beasts that represent the same nations that come out. And during this, we have in verse 8, there's these horns. Okay, let me back up. I feel like we have to have a basic understanding of what's being said here so that we can go into chapter 9. He says in verse 7, "I saw in the night visions, behold, a fourth beast." This would have been the Roman Empire. "A fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns." Okay, so the 10 horns, it is actually, you can, up to the time of the end of Israel, the end of Jerusalem, 70 AD, if you look up the number of emperors, there's 10 of them, if you count Caesar. And some people don't count Caesar, but I don't know why you wouldn't. So we have 10 that are reigning. So these are 10 horns. This is one way of looking at this. And it said in verse 8, "I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom the three of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. Okay? So we have another horn that comes up. It's not of the 10, so there's an 11th, but it's not really the 11th. It's one of the 10. And if you look in Roman history with the emperors, we have a year there that's called the year of the, what do they call that? Do you remember what that's called? When there are 4 different emperors in the same year. And 3 of them were supplanted by the one, Titus. And Titus wasn't actually emperor at that point, but his father became emperor, and his son Titus is the one that through war trampled these other 3 and destroyed them. So here's an example of that, at least the possibility of understanding. And it said that this horn, there in this horn, his eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. And at this point is when we have the image of God setting up a judgment scene. And then starting in verse 9, and it says in verse 11, because I watched then because of the sound of the pompous words which the horn was speaking, I watched till the beast was slain, his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. Okay, this is something that was decreed by the one who sat on this throne. And at the same time here we have in verse 13, the one coming like the Son of Man, who came with the clouds of heaven and sat at the right hand of God in heaven. So this is the same time during this period of time of these 10 kings. We have the establishment of Jesus on his throne. This is a big deal in denominational doctrines, especially when we're talking about premillennialism. That they have the idea that Jesus is going to come. This little horn that comes up is the Antichrist, and when he comes, he's going to establish himself, and then God will destroy him, and Jesus is going to set up his kingdom on the earth. And so there's a lot of discussion about this, but that's not Daniel's emphasis or focus. His focus was on what's going to happen when the coming of the Messiah came the first time, and we can go through that and discuss it. That's not the point. But to him was given dominion and glory, and that's verse 18. So in chapter 7, verse 14, he was given this kingdom. The same thing, it was depicted in Daniel chapter 2 with these 4 parts of the statue. During the days of the Roman Empire, God established his kingdom on this planet, and that is, he set up the kingdom, the church. So this is what is troubling him, and in chapter 7 we have the 4th beast, continuing on in verse 23, being explained, and the 10 horns or 10 kings in verse 24 who arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them, he shall be different, and he'll subdue 3 kings. So this is where the persecution of the saints comes in verse 25. All these things are difficult for him to understand, and so he comes in chapter 9. We have more explanation. So here's a prophecy. We call it the prophecy of the 70 weeks because there are 70 weeks that are mentioned. All right. So we're going to go through this, and I'll explain the way I understand it. Now, I don't claim to have all the answers. I've read a lot of different people who don't think this way, and that's okay. These things are difficult. Prophecy is difficult to interpret sometimes. We can know what it doesn't say, but sometimes we don't know exactly what it does say. And so I'm giving you what I think is the best explanation of this. And Wayne Jackson, if you want to look up him, ChristianCourier.com, I think is what it is. He's got some good stuff on there that doesn't agree with this, but it's still good. He has some good theories about it. Ultimately, it doesn't matter as long as we get the message. And but I want to give you at least a way to understand it that can help you, hopefully, as you're reading through this. So let me explain why this is so difficult. Let's look in verse 20, Daniel chapter 9 and verse 20. After he's praying and confessing his sin, which we read, verse 21, Gabriel came to them and to him and to tell him what was going to be. And he informed me in verse 22 and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand at the beginning of your supplication, which we already read. Let's read verse 24. This is what he said. 70 weeks, or the word weeks is actually not a Hebrew word. The word is sevens. So 70 sevens. This is how they would describe a week. So this is why it's said 70 weeks. 70 weeks are determined for your people, for your holy city. Incidentally, what is the holy city? Jerusalem, which is, at this point, is in ruins. It doesn't exist at this point. It exists, but it's in ruins. All right. For your people, your holy city, to finish the transgressions, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. All right. So there's 70 weeks to get all this done. Then he says in verse 25, Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah, the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. And after that, and after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood, and till the end of the war, desolations are determined. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. All right. So there's a lot going on here, but we're going to break it down and just at least see what he's trying to say is going on. So if you notice what he's saying here, there are several things that he lists that is the purpose of this 70 weeks, right? So we're in Daniel chapter 9. The first one he says is to finish transgression. Okay, so what does that tell you? What does the word finish mean? Does your translation have anything different? This would be verse 24. To bring to fulfillment. Yeah. So there's a difference between putting in an end that we have to understand, right? So you're right. It does mean bring it to an end. But it is talking about not the transgressions of the entire world, but the transgressions of this people. And it's going to be brought to a full end, a completion, right? This is the completion of the transgressions. Or what kind of transgressions had the Israelites, after the captivity is over, what kind of transgressions would they going to be involved in? It's not going to be idolatry, but it relates to what? Pride, yeah. What is yes, right. And I'm not trying to get you to read my mind. So I just hear what you were trying to say. This is good. So pride relates to this. What was the sin that the people did ultimately that brought about the end for them? Yes, the rejection of the Christ. That was and what was the reason Jesus said that they rejected the Christ? There were many reasons, I know, but there was one thing. It's what you said. It was their pride. They didn't want to. They wanted to be able to run the show. They thought that Jesus was going to come and be a certain way, and he didn't fit their mold. So they decided they rejected him. And it wasn't because they analyzed the scriptures and said, he said this about the Bible, and that's not true. He said that these prophecies were going to come true, and these prophecies aren't coming true about Jesus. It wasn't any kind of a reasoned thing like that, where they had any kind of evidence from the Bible to show that Jesus wasn't fulfilling the prophecies or whatever he said. It was because they didn't want him to be the Messiah. They wanted to be the one in control. And so they killed him. And Jesus talked about this as well. What did he say was going to happen because of their rejection of him? 70 AD. That's what he said was going to happen. Now, he didn't use those words, but he said, when the armies are encircling Jerusalem, you're going to know this is the coming of the Son of Man. In fact, he said, you're going to see me coming in power. And there's a lot of things going on there. We're going to have a study one day, a lesson just on the day of the Lord, because there's not just one day of the Lord, but there is the one that we're waiting for, and that's the one. But there are a lot of other times when God came in judgment. Jesus talked as if he's coming in judgment on Israel, and he did come in judgment on Israel, but not he himself personally. He did it through the Romans, and there was a massacre because of that. Incidentally, do you know how long the end war was at the end of Israel? Do you know how long that lasted? Do you happen to know, Joe? Do you know what I'm talking about? That it didn't culminate in 70 AD, because it actually was some people that escaped, and there was Masada still to come. Do you know how long that all lasted?
I think well into the second century, maybe about 120.
Yeah, you're right, because there was another uprising later. They kind of regathered the forces. I'm talking about the end with Titus and with all that. There's the Judean War, the Roman Jewish War. The height of it.
You talk about a day after 70 AD.
No, that the 70 AD is part of the Roman Jewish War. Yeah, so we're having. Oh, you're saying that the date ended? Yeah, that's right. So Masada and all that. It actually all from beginning to end. When the Romans finally stopped the attack, was 7 years. That's how long it took for them to do all that things. Now it did later on, another 100 years later. There was still another uprising. But they brought an end to everything. How did they bring an end to the Jewish system? What did they do that ended the Jewish economy?
They destroyed the temple.
Yeah.
They leveled Jerusalem.
They leveled Jerusalem.
That included the temple, and Titus it was actually Titus's field command who led that final charge. And on what had been the altar, he slaughtered pigs.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then they tore it all apart. Yeah. And rumor was that they were looking for the gold that was there, and which is very possible. Anyway, it was a slaughter, and there were thousands of Jews taken captive, but far more people killed and slaughtered. And this is exactly what Jesus said was going to happen to them. He gave warning. So we'll have to discuss that for a little bit, but this is where we need to continue on. Wow, we're already jumping into this. We got 20 minutes left. Let's go ahead and move on. We have the command to give and to restore the temple. From the command to restore the temple and build Jerusalem until the Messiah was 7 weeks and 62 weeks. I don't know why there's a division there. I know why there's a division afterward, probably, but I don't know why there's a division here. We got 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which is how many weeks? I'm making you think, I know. 69 weeks. So, all right, so can somebody with a calculator brain tell me how much 69 times 7 is? What, you don't know that off the top of your head? No, I know you don't. Let me find the number here. 483. All right, so here's an interesting thing. This 483 has always been, I shouldn't say always, modern people, modern scholars have interpreted this to be a representation of years. And it makes sense because we're talking about a length of time until all these things are going to happen. It says he's going to finish the transgressions to make an end of sins. Well, he made the end of the sins of the Jewish people, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. There's some pretty big things that's going to happen here. Okay, so if you extrapolate that these are a day represents a year, it gets you roughly to the time of Jesus. That's why people have said, well, this is talking about Jesus, talking about years. And that's really the only reason that people say that. There's not, as far as I can see, there's no indication in the scriptures that said, hey, 1 year equals 1 day. It doesn't say that. So we have to this is an interpretation. This is why there's problems. But if you even look at it generically, you can still come up with the idea that there's a long period of time, and then there's a short period of time at the end where some things are going to happen. All right? So you can see this, and this is why people will say, well, this is related to the end of time, which, granted, that's what it kind of sounds like sometimes. But we don't have to understand that. But here's an interesting thing to me. Depending on which decree, there were several decrees that came for Israel to go back and rebuild. The first one was Cyrus. Then we also have Artaxerxes, who we see this in Ezra chapter 7 and verse 13. It was this, in the 7th year of his reign that he made a decree. That was 458 to 457 BC. Now, if you use that date, which I'm going to use, and you add in 483 years, that puts you the end of the 69 weeks all the way to 27 AD, which is about the time Jesus started his ministry. So it makes sense from that perspective. The weakness of that is you have to start with a second decree, not the first decree, right? Which was quite a bit earlier. And so I recognize that's a weakness, but it is amazing how that works out. So we have the 69 weeks. Yeah.
Jason, I mean, yeah, Cyrus started.
Yeah.
But Artaxerxes, that finished.
Yeah, he was the one that,
The temple got rebuilt
under Artaxerxes. Yeah. Yeah. So the first one could relate to the first 7 weeks, and because it said 7 and then 62, it could be related to Cyrus and Artaxerxes. I don't really know, but I do know that it maths.
62 weeks plus minus 7.
Plus what?
62 weeks plus minus 7 weeks.
Plus or minus 7 weeks, yeah. It could be that. So anyway, I want you to just think about that. It is an interesting idea. We have also that, so that puts the end of 69 weeks, which he said was going to happen. 69 weeks is the end. All right. So what happened during Jesus' ministry? It doesn't say during the 69 weeks. They have 69 weeks left, and then we have another 7 days that comes after that, right? And so anyway, there's some interesting ideas here. King Herod died at about 4 BC. And we know, you know that the calendar is not actually correct for the years, because it's about 3 or 4 years off. And the reason, I don't know all the reasons, but it is. Herod died at 4 BC, but Jesus was born before or after Herod's death. Before his death, because Herod tried to kill him. In fact, when he sent to kill all the children, all the males, what age were they? 2 and below. So it's possible it's up to 2 years after Jesus' birth that he made this decree. So where does that put Jesus' birth? It's definitely before 3 or 4 BC. So it could have been 4 to 6, yeah, BC, which means that this isn't really 2024. It's technically, 2018? So, hey, you just went back 6 years of your life. Yeah. Anyway, so we can know from Luke chapter 3 that Jesus was 30 when he began baptizing and preaching. He said he was 30. So at 30, if he was born in 6 BC or 5 BC and he was 30, what year was it that he started preaching and teaching? It would have been about 24 or 25. And so that brings us to that point. So history, everything is going to be revealed, and then now we have the Messiah who starts his ministry, his campaign of preaching. Okay. Now, if you look in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 26, it says, after the 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off. Not during, but after. Okay, so after the 62 weeks, we have the Messiah that will be cut off. What does it mean to be cut off? And what do you think it means in this context? Death, right? That's what I think it means. So he's cut off. Even Isaiah chapter 53 uses that terminology. He's cut off. All right? And the people, the Messiah should be cut off, but not for himself. Okay? What does that imply? He's dying for someone else. Well, the world. Okay? But and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay. The people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The sanctuary and the city would be what? Is it hard to see that this is talking about Jerusalem? It's not a big leap at all. In fact, he's talking about the end. So after this period of 62 weeks, then we have a period of time when the prince will come and destroy. This is not the same prince who we read about already in this chapter. That is in verse 25, the Messiah, the prince. Okay, in a sense you could say it could be, but this prince is probably related to chapter 8. In chapter 8, we have the interpretation that I gave you before of the 10 kings and the 3 that were supplanted, and in my understanding, that's Titus. Titus was the son of Vespasian, who was emperor, but Titus and Vespasian were unique. They were different rulers because he was a co-reigner with his father, which was unheard of. He had great power even while he was alive, even while his father was still alive, still living. And they divided up the kingdom, but they were united in doing these different things together. So whenever he came in and destroyed Israel, the reason that he did it, well, he was running the campaign. Vespasian was running the campaign against Israel. And he had encircled them, and then began the year of the different emperors, where 3 of them were supplanted. And so Vespasian left Jerusalem, to go and put his bid in to win emperor, which he eventually did. And he left his son Titus there in control of this battle. And Titus, he may not have been there himself, but he was the one who was in control of it and making the decisions. And while Vespasian is establishing his kingdom, and Titus also was working in the east, trying to secure, this is a time of civil war, or potential civil war in Rome, and so they were very weak. So he was actually in the east, shoring up the boundaries, the borders, making sure they weren't being invaded. There's a lot of things going on here. But when Vespasian finally left and overcame the other 3, it was Titus who actually was instrumental in making sure that all happened. They all worked together. Okay? This is the way I understand it. So now, once that happened, I hope that you can see a clear picture of what's happening here, the history. Once that happened, Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, and then, of course, they spread out a little bit. Some people escaped, and there are other people. There had been a massive campaign already in that general area, and people had been flocking to Jerusalem for safety. And now they're running because the ones that could. These are historically what's going to happen. All right, so if you come back, that's what I was talking about. In Daniel chapter 7 and 8, this is the description of this little horn that I think is talking about that. And the horn then is going to be overcome and overthrown by the judgment of God against the people, against that horn, which is the Roman Empire, ultimately. Okay. I think I muddied up the waters. This is, sorry, this is not going the way exactly how I thought it was going to go, because I had it all laid out here, but then I started putting it together and realized there's a lot of history here I need to cover before we get to it. So let's look at this last week. It says in verse 27, He shall confirm a covenant and with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to the sacrifice and offering. All right. Now, the way I understand this is this is actually depicting the 7-year war that Rome had against Judea. When they went in and destroyed, they destroyed a lot. It wasn't just Jerusalem. They took over quite a bit of the territory. And in the middle of the week, he brings an end to sacrifice and offering. All right. What happened in the middle of this 7-year war is Jerusalem being destroyed. He brought an end to all of that. Now, Jesus did bring an end to sacrifices, but were they making sacrifices in the temple after Jesus' death? Yeah. They were doing it all through Paul's life, all the way up into 70 AD. They were still making sacrifices and oblations. So Jesus, yes, he brought an end to the old covenant, but they were still following the old covenant. At least the Israelites were. And Daniel being an Israelite, this relate to him. So he says, in the middle of this is when it comes, and it's on the wing of abominations, shall be one who makes desolate. All right, so this is a reference to, I believe, to coming in and destroying the temple, and what you said, sacrificing a pig on it. Antiochus Epiphanes did the same thing, and some people attribute this to Antiochus Epiphanes. It's a very popular idea, and it may be true, but we're seeing history repeat itself, if anything. And so when Titus went in, and whoever it was that went in and made the sacrifice, this would be abominations. This would be the one. And to make desolate means complete destruction, right? So this is a very good depiction, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. Okay, so now we have, this is something that is an ongoing campaign against Israel. When Jesus said that Jerusalem would be destroyed, he didn't mean it's going to happen in one day. It took a while, right? And that's part of what is being described here, and this is part of what is happening. But if you'll notice, we'll see here, forgot the passage, I don't have it written down. At one point, Gabriel tells him, seal this away, because it's still a long way off. He's talking about these prophecies. And it was 483 years, 500 years away. And he's saying that's a long way off. Go ahead and seal up these prophecies that are being made. Yeah. Oh, I was looking in the wrong chapter. Okay, after 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood, and till the end of the war, desolations are determined. Yes, I think that is talking about. Now, the first half of this is talking about the death of Jesus, but the second half of this is talking about the coming destruction of Jerusalem. Yeah. So, in my estimation, the death of Jesus is not inside these weeks. They're between the 69 weeks and the last week. And I recognize that it can look like talking about Jesus. The reason that I don't think it fits that is because there's in the middle of this week, supposedly, Jesus, he was cut off. So you'd say 3.5 years of his ministry, that's a half a week, and then he was cut off. That's true, it fits that, but the things afterward don't fit. So there's going to have to be a gap in there somewhere. But the 7-year war of the Jews against the Jews does fit. And so that's why I think that it's a movement. But anyway, what's the point of all of this that he's trying to give us to teach? What's the point of, and there's lots of stuff here. Matthew chapter 24 talks about this a lot. What is the message that Daniel is getting about Israel? It's going to come to an end. And it's going to come to an end because of iniquities. And God is the one who's in control. He's the one that's going to do it. And he can tell you what's going to happen. And whether or not this is years or just simply saying, here, there's a long stretch of time and a short stretch of time, or if he's being specific, it doesn't matter. Either way, it's still the truth. Still, we have the depiction of the death of Israel and the end of the sacrifices and things like this that were going to be taking place, which we knew was going to happen. So they take this, people take this and run with it and say, this is talking about the end of time. Look in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15. I think this actually helps too.
You know, Jason, we know because we have 2,000 years of hindsight, that the greatest heresy that the Apostle Paul had to deal with during his lifetime was the Judaizing Christians.
Yeah.
After the destruction of the temple in AD 70, the Judaizing Christians, they weren't Judaizing.
No.
Judaism
Yeah.
is gone.
Yeah, God dealt with that problem, didn't he? And there's an interesting thing I want to say this about this. It says, therefore, in verse 24, chapter 24 and verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads it, let him understand, then let those who in Judea flee to the mountains. This is what he's talking about. This is what I'm saying when he was saying the destruction was going to come. When you see all these things happening, and there's a lot more detail here, you run. And Josephus said that the Christians saw the signs that Jesus gave them and left Jerusalem, and not one Christian was killed. We don't know if that was actually him saying it or what, but we have historical statement saying that they weren't killed because they looked at the signs. Yeah.
You know, we know from secular history that Titus's field commander, after he laid siege to Jerusalem at the beginning, and I think he laid siege for about 6 months. And anyway, after about 6 months, he backed off. And he backed off for about 3 months.
Yeah.
During that 3 months, that's whenever the Christians, they knew what Jesus had said back over here in Matthew, and they got out of Dodge.
Yeah, that's right. Well, one last thing. It says that there's a gap here. This gap is between the beginning of Jesus' ministry and the beginning of the war against Israel. Do you know how long that gap was? It was 40 years. For the new covenant to be firmly established by this war that destroyed all the sacrifices and everything. How long was it between the patriarchal law and the Mosaic law being set up? You know how long have they had to integrate into that new law? Well, how long were they in the wilderness wandering? 40 years. So we have a period of time that's kind of a transitionary time there. We also have a period of time between the new covenant, the old covenant, and the new covenant of about 40 years of transition. And we all know that that's a transitionary time. We can see a lot of evidence of that. There were still Jewish things going on, but in 70 AD, God took care of all that stuff, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. So anyway, except for people trying to bring it up. All right, well, that's everything. We want to discuss it more. We can sit down and talk about it. It's fascinating to me. I think there's a lot there. I wish we could cover it a little bit longer.